easily. Okay, so I will talk about something well, more variable-oriented again, substantive variable, educational attainment. And I want to first give you some idea of why this should be interesting to you and to everybody in survey methodology at all and people using survey data. Well, educational attainment is a variable that's included in most statistical models analyzing data relationships in substantive terms, either as a substantive or as a control variable. But then, while we worry very much about measurement error in measurement of attitudes and beliefs, where we have really multiple indicator batteries and can estimate measurement error, as people are also learning here in the summer school with JAC, for example, that's quite difficult to do with background variables where we only have one measurement, but not multiple measurements where we can control for these things. So with educational attainment, you pretty much have to put everything into the design of the variable rather than the statistical correction later. And the additional complexity here is added, of course, in a cross-national survey like the European Social Survey, that we want to do that at the design level for 36 countries. I don't even know how many countries I've been working with altogether over time. And the main issue here that I found in my research is aggregation error, which is the degree to which an association is attenuated or decreased substantively by lumping categories together. And when you have a categorical variable like educational attainment, there's so and so many response categories on the show card, and when you end up putting them into 3 categories like low, medium, and high, you're losing a lot of information. And basically losing information means you're losing explanatory power and your correlations go down. That's the degree to which that happens differs across countries, which means that always aggregation error is not the same across countries, meaning that your conclusions may also be wrong when you're looking at the effects of education or you're trying to control for education. You're pretty much not actually controlling for it. And so that's a very short story, so everybody who needs to be now can already go, but I will show some more details now. So the example that brought me to look into this more closely was that I wanted to research educational inequalities across Europe. I wanted to check where does parents' education have a higher or lower impact on their children's or the respondents' education, and see what structural characteristics and educational system characteristics may predict those differences. And I found results that I found really stunning, because I read a lot of the social mobility and stratification literature, and usually the countries that came up with the lowest association in the ESS are the ones where we know that there's actually quite a lot of educational inequality. So in Germany, for example, with the 3-tiered school system, highly stratified, we know that a lot of parental resources go into their children's education, and they correlate very highly, but in the ESS it didn't look like that. Germany looked like the most equal country in Europe. That was sounded pretty absurd to me. And only the second group of countries, the Scandinavians, are the ones where we thought, like, yeah, here it may be quite right. Again, in Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal, I didn't believe that the associations would really be the highest. It doesn't make too much sense, but then what came to me is that in these countries, educational expansion took place later. So in the samples that you find in a population of adult people, you have more people with very low education, which you don't find in many other countries anymore, because that was generations earlier and these people are not included in the survey anymore. So basically I thought there must be some methodological problem here. And that's how I came to survey methodology, basically. So that's the brief story about it. I will now summarize briefly several ways of how to compare education across countries for cross-national research. Very, very popular, of course, is just using years of education. Everybody knows how that works. It's simple, straightforward, and I will show you some results later, what happens if you do that. Then there are classifications. Very naively, what I already said, low, medium, high, or primary, secondary, higher education. It's quite commonly used as well, but then you don't really need to think about it so much and just eyeball what you think is low, medium, and high. There is the International Standard Classification of Education from UNESCO, which was developed for administrative data first and later on applied in official surveys, and then also in the European Social Survey and some others. And finally, the Kasman Education Scheme, which has been developed by stratification researchers specifically for cross-national survey research and mobility research. So that differs quite a lot in how it came about. There's also a procedure called optimal scaling that allows us to sort of produce a linear value that says how much an educational qualification is worth relative to some outcome, say income or social status or something else, which also means you can get a linear variable and it's easier to deal with than with lots of categories. And finally, test scores. I will not really talk about that at all because it's a different concept. You know, how well people do in school or how literate they are, how well they deal with numbers, or how numerate they are. That's really like in the PISA studies, for example, where you have a complex testing instrument to really assess certain competences. That's really a different thing, but it's very interesting to look at how that actually relates to educational qualifications and attainment, just to mention a few for completeness. I think I will now browse over that because otherwise it takes too long.
Further study in the vocational sphere. The duration of programs are different at, for example, the first stage of tertiary used to be everything higher education below the PhD, so the duration criterion would differentiate bachelor and masters, for example, and others. The problem with ISCAT 97 was really that there was no standard coding scheme. We had sort of main levels and some letters and some abbreviations, but it wasn't something that you really like to work with in data. Meaning every user implemented it differently. There was not enough standardization around yet. There is now ISCAT 2011. I was part of the consultation panel with UNESCO to develop this, and it was a huge amount of work. What we achieved was getting 8 levels, or rather 9 if you include the 0. But the biggest change really is that there is no 3-digit standard coding system. You probably know ISCO for occupation, so we're trying to get a bit closer to that to really get some more detail and specification in there. There is also now education attainment is included specifically in terms of the definitions and the classification. Before it was educational programs, but I think that's going into too much detail. And the official mappings are currently being developed because the classification was adopted in late 2011, and now the countries have been working very hard. 2014, the first data, official data, labour force surveys using ISCAT 2011 will be collected. But with the ESS we were much faster, which is very nice. So we actually have some unofficial ISCAT 2011 data already since 2011, since data are out pretty much. CASMIN, I already said something about that. It's also much more detailed than the old ISCAT, so you can already see it was like ahead of time in terms of like differentiation and preciseness. But there's other disadvantages connected to it because it's not an official classification, it doesn't speak to official data, and also it is very limited in terms of how well it is maintained over time and documented. I'll skip over that. So ESS strategy for measuring education. In rounds 1 to 4, what's always been the same and still is the same, there is a country-specific education question in every country because, of course, the systems are so different, you can't give the same response categories to everybody. Because then you would have to ask for primary, secondary, etc. And these things mean different things in different countries. So that's not really a translation issue, but a harmonization issue. So basically, the questions and the variables are different for every country, and we now need to find a way to bring them together. And these mappings and keys that I told you about earlier for ISCAT are the key way of doing that. So in ESS rounds 1 to 4, this was all coded into the main levels of ISCAT 97. But there were quite a number of problems came up when looking at the data closely. For example, often the data collected wasn't precise enough in the countries to be codable into the ex-ante specified framework that it should be coded into. For example, in many countries, it doesn't make sense to differentiate between people who have no education at all and just primary because the compulsory level is lower secondary. So the countries just didn't implement that and didn't really think of maybe immigrant groups where the distinction would be meaningful. There's also a lot of deviations from the official mappings because they were not very well known, and it has only like trickled through with time that there's actually some documentation about how to code from the national to the international standards. As a result, of course, the distributions were sometimes very different from what you find in official statistics, which people were not very comfortable with, of course, because you claim to use the same standard and something entirely different comes out, or something very different. And finally, collapsing quite complex differentiated educational systems into 7 categories, or because we have to make cuts at the end, only 5, means that you lose a lot of information on the way. And some categories got really big, like ISCAT 3, upper secondary, means everybody who's got a university entrance qualification or vocational training at a similar age is in the same category. That's 80% of the population in the Czech Republic. So that's not really very helpful for your data analysis anymore. Since round 5, there's much more detailed country-specific educational attainment variables and questions, which were developed together with the national teams to improve the validity and potential for harmonization. So now in all countries you can differentiate university education from non-university tertiary education, you can differentiate general from vocational everywhere, and these things have just been sort of implemented across countries in a more rigorous way. We have now a 3-digit variable for education in the ESS, which many people get shocked by because they want to have something really simple and then they get maybe 25 categories. 3 digits doesn't mean you have 1,000 different categories, right? It's just that's what we need to kind of make sort of logical and useful distinctions where you can maybe also do some adjustments later. And then we did the central consultation to improve the consistency across countries, because if every country does that individually and decentrally like it was in ESS rounds 1 to 4, there's always differences in interpretation and in how you implement a certain category. And finally, we also developed an analytical variable from the detailed variable, because of course you don't want to run a statistical model with 25 dummies for education as an independent variable. So there's a simplified one, which also has 7 categories like ISCAT, but has much more information because it takes apart what is very different and makes up these huge categories in some countries, and it puts together what's less important in most countries in Europe, which of course is always a bit arbitrary and poses problems for those countries that are kind of outliers, like Portugal, for example, where there's lots of low-educated people, and then if you put the low categories together into one, you're still losing something. I will skip over this as well. That's the coding scheme that was implemented, and this now is the simplified variable. So this is something that you can kind of interpret substantively, and it's more meaningful than ISCAT, but it's not more complex than ISCAT, and you can derive it from the detailed ones. And as a researcher, you can go to the data, take the detailed variable, and recode in another way, any way you are interested in for your kind of research questions and topics. Because sometimes you may actually only want academic and general education. Maybe you're not thinking that vocational education is important for the question you're looking at, or you want to look at it separately. And now you can sort of code all that from the data yourself. So evaluating how all this worked out and if it helped at all, this chart shows a comparison of comparisons. So we have the green line shows the difference in distributions between the second round of the ESS, so before the revision, and the later fall survey at the same time, in the same year. And it shows that we have quite large differences in many countries. And the blue line shows what happened with round 5, the changes. And so for all the countries up to Norway, these are the countries where we see quite a lot of improvement. So the difference between the official and the ESS data has decreased. It's much lower now. And there's many countries where there's actually not a big difference, which is also nice. So these are consistent over time despite the revision, and they're very often there for substantive reasons. For example, for the UK, we don't quite believe that the way they do it officially is a good way, because they kind of try to make their education statistics look a bit nicer than they are, which unfortunately happens with education. It's a very normative thing. And also in Poland, we made some changes also to better reflect educational reforms, which in the official classification are totally neglected. So when there's a reform, sometimes a whole cohort of people sort of is pushed up a level, even though there wasn't actually any change in their attainment. So this shows like there were some improvements, and sometimes we make things maybe worse, but for theoretical and empirical reasons that we thought are justified to improve comparability. So that was always the leading argument was, does this improve the comparability across countries? We don't really need to compare very much with official data. It's a nice benchmark to look at, but we wanted to mainly compare countries. Non-informative data, just like how many don't knows and other non-informative data do you get when you have a much more complex data collection instrument? And that wasn't really a problem. So these are really percentages of people in the survey in different countries. It's just in the UK that lots of people really don't know their qualifications. But that's not really a methodological problem, it's a substantive one also, because education attainment is much less important in the UK than in many other countries for people's later life outcomes. It gets quite bad though when we look at parents' education. I show here the data for fathers, and almost 40% of British respondents don't know what the educational qualification of their father is. So that's quite dramatic, and it's very hard to deal with. And I'm quite curious about the next round and how we can really try to tackle that. With most other countries, it's quite all right though still, but the complicated systems that went through lots of changes are really the most difficult ones here. Russia, Estonia as well. And in the UK, pretty much each government renames qualifications. That's one of the issues here. And now this is one of the core results I want to show. This looks very confusing at first sight. I'm now here predicting ISEI scores, social status scores, by education attainment, measured in 5 different ways. Using the simple ISCAT variable we have in the first 4 ESS rounds, using the complex one, which nobody really uses in data analysis, but just to show how much you can actually gain by having a differentiated variable. ISCAT 2011, of course the unofficial version. ES-ISCAT is the simplified variable that we also provide now, and years of education. And most information is, of course, contained in the most complex variable, the level B, which is actually doesn't lose any substantive information compared to the national variable, which is really nice. So it's comparable, you have categories you can interpret across countries, but it still has the same amount of information overall as the national variables that I cannot show you here because that would just really make the thing explode. We can see very well that the old ISCAT variable that we had is much worse, and also the degree to which it is worse differs a lot across countries. So sometimes you have these blue peaks going down. There's actually here, this is the average across all countries, so you can rank the measures easily across all ESS countries. ISCAT 2011 is already doing much better than the old ISCAT, but still it's not working very well in some countries, and I mentioned the Czech Republic already to you. And that's because the system is so expanded that most people are in a certain level, and if you don't make any distinctions within that level, you're losing so much information. It's really not doing very well as a predictor anymore. ES-ISCAT, however, takes that decision, this distinction, and so you can see that in the Czech Republic, ES-ISCAT works almost as good with 7 categories as the detailed harmonized variable 25. So the red line pretty much shows you that we don't lose that much by collapsing if we collapse in a meaningful way. Right, conclusions. Okay, I didn't keep my promise, so whoever wants to go for a beer with me afterwards can do that. Years of education really has a very limited reliability and validity as a single measure. It's not working very well. People have to calculate really when they are being asked in a survey how many years of education they have and whether they should include part-time or vocational, etc. It's quite tricky. But it's quite useful in multiple indicator models. So if you do optimal scaling, then you're really happy to have this variable because it gives you independent information about somebody's level of education. And there's some people working on deriving those scores for ESS data as well. The naive classification is like ISCAT, of course, because it's even worse than the normal ISCAT levels. That's why I didn't show it anymore. It's really underspecified, and the categories are internally so heterogeneous that they don't explain much anymore. In multivariate analysis, it looks like you've included education, but pretty much you haven't, I would argue. CASMIN is very nice. It works very well. It's a very high regarded tool, but it's only available for a very limited set of countries where the people who did research in that network were pretty much working. So it's not as international as ISCAT is, because ISCAT we pretty much have for all countries in the world, almost. Of course, the more recent countries are still missing. So even though ISCAT is not the gold standard, I think if it's implemented well, it can do a pretty good job. Because there's so much documentation and information available, which we can use, but we pretty much have to transform it to make it useful for survey research. Further issues, foreign qualifications and immigration are quite tricky, and long shortcuts. I'm working on that now in a new project, which I will not talk about, but give you some takeaway messages. Don't trade validity or comparability for parsimony. You know, many people say that, oh, I want to have only 3 categories in my education variable. That's a request I get by email very often. How can I do this variable into 3 categories? And then I say, well, why do you want to have 3 categories to start with? Even a 4th one already helps a lot to gain a bit more information and better control for education. And sometimes it's quite easy to actually find problems by not running experiments, which is one way of dealing with finding errors, but really do sensitivity analysis. Try various model specifications, try various codings, and you will maybe see differences. And if you don't see them, use 3 categories, then it's fine, but please test it before you do. And finally, don't forget about theory. When we use education in data analysis, very often people just say, well, I'm controlling for education, but we're not really arguing very much anymore why we actually want to do that, and what the expected mechanisms or relationships are, or mediating effects, moderating effects, etc. But education is such a strong predictor very often and produces very, very strong correlations that it's really worth thinking about what that implies for your theoretical models as well. So I think I also went 5 minutes over my time. Thanks a lot for staying longer.
Yes, perhaps more comments than a question. I like very much the work that was done in the SS on education. I think it was really remarkable and really needed. But one point that we've just mentioned, but for me it's very important, it's also a political issue. So it's not only an issue about measurement, where we have just to find a good value, to say the thing like that, but each country tries to put forward some challenges. And of course, for example, the fight between vocational training and general training is very important in very, very, very big number of countries. And this appears also in the way that it can take into account the part in one direction or the other. In this sense, I think that the official statistics sometimes could be really misleading, and it's far better to elaborate something which could be a little bit more scientific than political, but we have to deal also with this political front.
That's why we really decided in the ESS to not follow the official things for the UK, which classifies the qualification that people get at age 16 in one level higher than everybody else in Europe. And of course, it's like 25% of the population, and they just push them up like this. And I've had lots of debates with official people from the National Statistical Office in the UK, and they all know the issue, but they've been doing it since the 70s. It would be such a loss of face for them to actually make that change now. It's incredible, but we can do that because we are not dependent on them as an academic survey with the ESS, and I think that's a real advantage, and we do that. Also, comparing with official data as a benchmark is really hard because the official data don't publish their mappings. They don't say how exactly they coded the national variables into the international ones, and how can we trust something as a benchmark if it's not well documented. So we can just guess, you know, they use ESTEP mappings, but it's different. And EU-SILC and EU-LFS differ a lot from each other again. So what's the credibility of, you know, survey data coming from Eurostat, from the same office, which should use the same standards, but they are very divergent results. So I thought that was quite shocking. So I would really invite everybody to look into things more closely, look under the carpet, because there's lots of interesting things to be found there. Really. Further questions and ideas? Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question. At the very beginning, you showed the different correlations between children and parents in education, and you offered the explanation that the measurement policy may be different in countries. My question is now, if you use your new data, how does it show?
Thanks for the question. Come to the ECSR conference in Tilburg in October. I've been planning to do these analysis for quite a long time.
So you are hiding the numbers? So you are hiding the numbers?
No, I just still have to do the analysis because I didn't manage to do them yet. I mean, I had a first look and some things changed. Of course, it's not dramatic, but Germany is not the most equal country anymore. I can tell you that. But it's not like the most unequal either. You know, so I mean, there's both things. Maybe because of the research that was done previously was also quite limited, looking at certain countries only, and didn't have always the greatest data either. So, you know, we have never had any indicators comparing so many European countries in a very good way with respect to education and equality. Really doing this is something that hasn't been done before, and I'm really curious to do it. It's just summer schools and other business that keeps me from doing it. But yeah, October.
It's very important work that you are doing, I'm sure. And you should know that education is the most used predictor in all sources research.
Jack, I can thank you for bringing it into the ESS network as well, because if there weren't supporters like you and also others in the ESS network, you know, how could these changes be done? But ESS is one of those surveys that's pretty open to user feedback. If there is something, you know, you find that looks fishy, tell them. Really, I mean, there's so many quality enhancement meetings, they've been working on lots of variables. Of course, you have to make sure that the time series can be kept kind of, which with the education variables is possible. You can go back to the old worst variables if you have to, and you have to if you want to compare the 5 time points, right? But at least you kind of know how to interpret the data and what the problems might be. It gets some more awareness in there.